Before we dive into the chilling depths of this story, if you find yourself captivated by tales of mystery, suspense, and the human psyche, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Your support helps bring more compelling narratives to life. The air in Elmwood, a town nestled amidst the sprawling forests of New England, had always carried a certain crispness, a scent of pine and damp earth that spoke of nature's quiet grandeur. It was a place where generations had lived and died, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the changing seasons, and where the most significant events were often little more than a successful harvest or a particularly harsh winter. This tranquility, however, was about to be shattered irrevocably and violently by a force that would leave an indelible scar on the wood and the collective American consciousness. The first hint of the impending darkness came not with a bang, but with a whisper, a subtle shift in the communal psyche. It began, as many profound changes do, with the mundane. September 12, 1987, dawned much like any other late summer day. The sun, a golden orb in a sky of deepening blue, cast long shadows across the neat lawns and picket fences of Elmwood. Children, oblivious to the storm brewing, gathered at bus stops, their laughter echoing through the morning air. Adults, with their steaming mugs of coffee and the rustle of newspapers, prepared for another day of predictable routines. Eliza Thorne, a spry woman of 68, was already on her second cup of Earl Grey when the phone rang. Her house, a charming Victorian with a wraparound porch, was a testament to her meticulous nature. Every antique gleamed, every cushion was fluffed, and the scent of freshly baked bread often wafted from her kitchen. She picked up the receiver, expecting a call from her bridge club, but the voice on the other end was not the familiar cadence of Mrs. Henderson. It was Chief Miller, his tone unusually grave. "Eliza, it's Frank. I need you to brace yourself." Eliza's heart, usually a steady drum, began to flutter. Chief Miller, a man of few words and unwavering stoicism, never spoke with such trepidation. "Frank, what on earth is it?" "It's the Morgans," he said, and the name, innocent in itself, seemed to hang in the air, heavy with unspoken dread. They're gone." "Gone? What do you mean, gone? Did they finally take that trip to Florida?" Eliza knew the Morgans, a quiet couple, had often spoken of escaping the harsh New England winters. "No, Eliza, not like that. They were found this morning. All of them. In their home." Chief Miller's voice cracked slightly, a sound Eliza had never heard before. "It wasn't an accident." The words hit Eliza like a physical blow. The Morgans, Thomas and Sarah, and their two children, 10-year-old Emily and 7-year-old Michael. Family. Wiped out. The idyllic image of Elmwood, painted in strokes of serenity and safety, began to crumble around her. News travels fast in small towns, especially news of such a horrific nature. By lunchtime, the hushed whispers had turned into panicked murmurs, and by dinner, a suffocating blanket of fear had descended upon Elmwood. The local news channels, usually content with reporting on bake sales and high school football scores, were now ablaze with flashing headlines: "Elmwood Family Massacre. Unspeakable Tragedy in New England Town." The scene at the Morgan residence, as described by the few officials brave enough to speak to the press, was one of unimaginable horror. The house, usually a beacon of warmth and familial activity, had been transformed into a macabre tableau. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle. The Morgans had been found in their beds, each with a single, precise stab wound to the heart. It was a chillingly intimate act, executed with a disturbing lack of visible violence. No broken furniture, no ransacked rooms, no blood splattered indiscriminately. Just the stark, silent evidence of lives extinguished with methodical efficiency. Detective James Maxwell, a seasoned veteran from the state police, arrived in Elmwood that evening, his face grim, his eyes already carrying the weary burden of 1,000 grim investigations. He was a man shaped by the harsh realities of urban crime, but even he felt a prickle of unease as he drove through the quiet, tree-lined streets of Elmwood. The silence here was different, heavier, than the familiar hum of the city. It was a silence that spoke of innocence lost, of a community holding its breath. Maxwell, a man in his late 40s with a receding hairline and a perpetually furrowed brow, had seen it all, or so he thought. He had dealt with domestic disputes turned deadly, drug deals gone sour, and the random acts of violence that plague urban centers. But this felt different. The calculated precision, the apparent lack of motive, the complete absence of struggle, it all pointed to something far more sinister than a typical robbery or a crime of passion. His initial walkthrough of the Morgan home confirmed his darkest suspicions. The house was meticulously clean, almost pristine, save for the grim evidence in the bedrooms. He noted the undisturbed flower vase on the dining table, the perfectly aligned books on the shelves, the children's toys neatly put away. It was as if death had arrived, silently and politely, before carrying out its heinous deed. The only anomaly was a single white rose placed delicately on Sarah Morgan's pillow, its petals unblemished, a stark contrast to the horror surrounding it. "Chief Miller," Maxwell said, his voice a low rumble. "Who would do something like this? And why?" Miller, a man whose face usually reflected the unyielding granite of New England, looked pale and shaken. "We don't know, Detective. There's no forced entry, no signs of struggle. It's like they just let him in. Or they knew him," Maxwell countered, his gaze sweeping across the living room. "This isn't a random act. This is personal. Or it's a statement." The forensic team worked tirelessly, their hushed movements and the whirring of their equipment the only sounds breaking the oppressive silence. They found no fingerprints other than those of the family and a few smudged prints belonging to Chief Miller and his officers. No DNA evidence. No weapon. It was a ghost of a crime, leaving behind only the chilling emptiness of the absence. The medical examiner, Dr. Eleanor Vance, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper intellect, delivered her findings with a professional detachment that barely masked her own revulsion. All 4 victims died from a single, deep stab wound to the heart. The weapon was a sharp, thin blade, likely a stiletto or a hunting knife with a particularly narrow tip. The angle of entry suggests a deliberate, precise thrust. They were all asleep, or at least incapacitated, when the wounds were inflicted. No defensive wounds whatsoever. "And the time of death?" Maxwell asked, his pen poised over his notepad. "Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., Dr. Vance replied. "Consistent with all 4. Whoever did this was efficient. And fast." The white rose on Sarah Morgan's pillow became a focal point of the investigation. It was a strange, almost poetic touch, a perverse signature. Was it a sign of remorse? A taunt? Or something far more disturbing? Eliza Thorne, still reeling from the news, found herself drawn to the local church, seeking solace in the familiar hymns and the comforting presence of Father Michael. But even there, the air was thick with unspoken fear. The small talk that usually accompanied the Sunday service was replaced by hushed conversations, anxious glances, and a pervasive sense of vulnerability. The funeral for the Morgans was a somber affair, attended by virtually every resident of Elmwood. The collective grief was palpable, a heavy shroud draped over the entire town. As the caskets were lowered into the earth, a single unifying question echoed in everyone's minds. Who, and would they strike again? Days bled into weeks, and the investigation, despite Maxwell's tireless efforts, yielded little. He interviewed every neighbor, every acquaintance, every person who had even a passing connection to the Morgans. No one had seen anything suspicious. No one had heard anything out of the ordinary. It was as if the killer had materialized from thin air, carried out their gruesome act, and then vanished back into the shadows. The media, initially focused on the tragedy, began to shift its narrative. Elmwood, once a symbol of small-town Americana, was now portrayed as a place of simmering fear, a town held hostage by an unseen terror. The story dominated national headlines, igniting a wave of public discourse about safety, vulnerability, and the nature of evil. Every news channel ran segments. Every newspaper dedicated entire pages to the Elmwood massacre. Crime experts speculated. Psychologists offered profiles. and the public devoured every shred of information, morbidly fascinated by the unfolding horror. Maxwell, however, was growing increasingly frustrated. The lack of evidence, the absence of a clear motive, the chilling precision of the killings, it all pointed to a killer unlike any he had encountered before. He spent countless hours poring over the case files, looking for patterns, for anomalies, for anything that could shed light on the darkness that had descended upon Elmwood. He replayed the 911 call, a frantic, broken voice of a neighbor who had gone to check on the Morgans after not seeing them for a day. He reread the medical examiner's report, searching for any detail he might have overlooked. One evening, as he sat alone in his makeshift office at the Elmwood police station, the silence of the town pressing in on him, he noticed a subtle detail in Dr. Vance's report. The white rose. She had mentioned its pristine condition, the way it had been placed, almost ceremonially, on Sarah Morgan's pillow. It wasn't just a random flower. It was intentional. A signature, he murmured to himself, the word hanging heavy in the air. A killer who leaves a calling card. That was a game changer. It spoke of a calculated mind, a desire to communicate, to mark their territory. But what was the message? As October arrived, painting the New England landscape in fiery hues of crimson and gold, Elmwood remained gripped by fear. Halloween, usually a joyous occasion for children, was canceled. Parents kept their children indoors, locked their doors, and cast nervous glances at every shadow. The once vibrant community had become a ghost town, its inhabitants living in a perpetual state of anxiety. Then, 2 weeks after the Morgan massacre, the phone rang again at Chief Miller's office. This time, it was from the neighboring town of Willow Creek, a small agricultural community 10 miles east of Elmwood. Another family, the Andersons, found in their beds, each with a single, precise stab wound to the heart. And on Mrs. Anderson's pillow, another pristine white rose. The news ripped through Elmwood like a wildfire, confirming everyone's worst fears. It wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a random act of violence. There was a killer, and they were still out there. And they were just getting started. The echoes of Elmwood were now spreading, carrying the genesis of a fear that would soon engulf an entire nation. The Elmwood massacre was no longer a local tragedy. It was the opening act of a chilling saga, a prelude to a reign of terror that would soon paralyze America. Detective Maxwell felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He was no longer hunting a local killer. He was hunting a ghost, a predator who moved with silent precision, leaving behind only the stark evidence of their depravity and a single, white rose as their chilling calling card. The hunt had begun, and the stakes could not be higher. The quiet terror of Elmwood was about to explode onto the national stage. The discovery of the Anderson family in Willow Creek sent shockwaves far beyond the quiet confines of New England. The media, already heavily invested in the Elmwood case, escalated their coverage to a fever pitch. The White Rose Killer, screamed the headlines, a name that quickly became synonymous with terror and the chilling precision of the unknown assailant. The image of a delicate, pristine white rose, juxtaposed with the brutal reality of the murders, seared itself into the collective consciousness of America. Detective James Maxwell, now thrust into the national spotlight, found himself at the epicenter of a storm. The Elmwood police station, once a sleepy outpost, was now a buzzing hive of activity. FBI agents, profilers, and an army of state troopers descended upon the town, their presence a stark reminder of the escalating gravity of the situation. Maxwell, however, felt a growing sense of isolation amidst the cacophony. He had seen the fear in the eyes of the Elmwood residents, felt the heavy burden of their unanswered questions. He knew this wasn't just another case. It was a psychological battle against a phantom. The pattern was undeniable, horrifyingly consistent. The Andersons, a family of 4, parents and 2 teenage children found in their beds. A single, precise stab wound to the heart. No forced entry. No struggle. And the signature, a single white rose. The meticulousness of the killings, the lack of any discernible evidence, suggested a killer operating with an almost surgical efficiency, a ghost moving through the night. Dr. Eleanor Vance, the medical examiner, presented her findings for the Anderson family, mirroring her previous report for the Morgans. Identical cause of death. Same type of weapon, same angle of entry. Time of death consistent, between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. No defensive wounds. They were either asleep or incapacitated. She paused, her eyes meeting Maxwell's. This individual is incredibly precise, detective, and they know what they're doing. FBI behavioral analyst Dr. Sarah Jenkins, a sharp-witted woman with an uncanny ability to delve into the criminal mind, arrived from Quantico. Her presence was both reassuring and unnerving. She brought with her the weight of the Bureau's vast resources, but also the sobering reality that they were dealing with a truly exceptional and exceptionally dangerous individual. Based on the consistency of the methods, Dr. Jenkins began during their first briefing, her voice calm and authoritative. We are looking at a highly organized, meticulous individual. The lack of forced entry suggests either the victims knew their killer, or the killer is adept at bypassing security. The absence of defensive wounds indicates an element of surprise, perhaps even a non-confrontational approach. They could be charming, disarming, or they could be entering homes where the residents are already asleep. And the White Rose? Maxwell interjected, his voice heavy with the question that haunted them all. The rose is crucial, Jenkins replied, her gaze intense. It's a deliberate choice, a symbolic gesture. White roses often represent purity, innocence, new beginnings, even silence. In this context, it could be a twisted sense of purity, cleansing, or a message of control and dominance. It's a psychological marker, a way for the killer to assert their power and leave their unique imprint. It suggests narcissism, a desire for recognition, however perverse. The profiling efforts painted a chilling picture. An intelligent, cunning, and highly controlled individual, likely male, in his late 20s to early 40s. He was probably an outsider to these small towns, or at least someone who could blend in seamlessly, not drawing attention. He was meticulous in his planning and execution, leaving no trace, almost mocking the authorities with his precision. As the investigation broadened, the FBI established a national hotline, and the media campaigns intensified. Images of the victims, their innocent faces juxtaposed with the stark reality of their deaths, flooded television screens and newspaper front pages. The public reacted with a mixture of fear, outrage, and a desperate plea for answers. Parents across America tightened security, checked on their children more frequently, and peered suspiciously at strangers. The sense of invulnerability, especially in rural and suburban areas, had been shattered. Weeks turned into a month, and the absence of any new attacks brought a fragile, tentative breath of relief. Perhaps the killer had vanished, disappeared back into the shadows from which he had emerged. But Maxwell and Jenkins knew better. This was a predator who operated on his own timetable. He was likely observing, planning, and waiting for the opportune moment to strike again. Their grim premonition proved tragically accurate. On November 28th, a cold, blustery day, the news broke from a small town in rural Pennsylvania, Fairview. The Millers, a family of 3 parents and their only child, a 16-year-old boy, found in their beds. The same single, precise stab wound. No forced entry. And on Mrs. Miller's pillow, another pristine white rose. The geographically disparate locations of the murders, New England, then Pennsylvania, added another layer of complexity and fear. It indicated that the killer was mobile, moving across state lines, making him even harder to track. He wasn't tied to a specific location. He was a phantom, a whisper of death carried on the wind. The scale of the investigation exploded. Task forces were formed in multiple states, intelligence was shared, and an unprecedented level of interagency cooperation was initiated. The White Rose killer became a national obsession, a dark figure looming over every household. Conspiracy theories flourished, internet forums buzzed with amateur detectives, and self-proclaimed psychics offered their dubious insights. Maxwell and Jenkins, along with their teams, pored over maps, looking for patterns in the chosen locations. All were small, quiet towns, often with a sense of close-knit community. All were relatively affluent, but not ostentatiously so. All families seemed to be ordinary, unremarkable people, with no obvious enemies or connections to organized crime. The victims were chosen not for who they were, but for what they represented. The archetypal American family shattered. "He's targeting families," Jenkins observed during one of their late-night sessions, the glow of the computer screens illuminating her thoughtful face. "The intact family unit. There's a symbolic element here. He's destroying what he perceives as fundamental, perhaps something he feels he was denied or something he resents." The psychological profile deepened. The killer likely harbored deep-seated resentments, possibly stemming from childhood trauma or a pervasive sense of inadequacy. The methodical nature of the killings, the control exhibited, suggested an individual who felt powerless in other aspects of their life and gained immense satisfaction from this ultimate act of dominance. The white rose, in this context, could be a symbol of a twisted kind of artistry, a perverse attempt at creating something perfect in his wake. Public fear reached unprecedented levels. Retailers reported a surge in sales of home security systems, gun sales soared, and neighborhood watch programs became ubiquitous. The once open, trusting nature of small-town America began to erode, replaced by suspicion and a chilling sense of vulnerability. Children, once free to roam, were now kept under close surveillance. The innocent joy of the holiday season was replaced by a pervasive sense of dread. As Christmas approached, the national mood grew increasingly somber. The thought of a killer moving silently through the night, selecting his next victims, cast a dark shadow over festivities. Maxwell, consumed by the case, spent Christmas Eve hunched over case files, the faces of the victims staring back at him from countless photographs. He felt the weight of their stolen lives, the burden of a nation's fear. Then, in early January, the pattern deviated. Not in method, but in location. This time, the call came from a suburb of Cleveland, Ohio. The Martins, a young couple with a newborn baby. All three found in their beds. The single, precise stab wound. No forced entry. And on Mrs. Martin's pillow, a white rose. The inclusion of a newborn baby sent a fresh wave of revulsion and outrage across the country. It solidified the image of the White Rose Killer as a monster, devoid of empathy, capable of inflicting the ultimate horror without compunction. The media frenzy intensified, commentators debated the nature of evil, and politicians called for more resources, more funding, more answers. The shift to a suburban area, a seemingly more populated and safer environment, was a chilling development. It showed the killer was adapting, perhaps growing bolder, and was not confined to the rural havens he had previously targeted. This meant no one was truly safe. Dr. Jenkins revised her profile. "He's escalating. The targeting of an infant demonstrates a complete lack of moral boundaries, a further embrace of his sadistic tendencies. This killer is gaining confidence, and perhaps a perverse sense of satisfaction from the fear he's generating. He wants to be known, to be feared, but he's also incredibly careful not to be caught. The psychological game is intensifying." Maxwell, weary but resolute, felt the pressure mount with each passing day. He knew they were dealing with a highly intelligent individual, someone who enjoyed the cat-and-mouse game. The killer was observing them, learning from their methods and constantly evolving. He was not just taking lives. He was systematically dismantling the fabric of trust and safety in America. The only consistent, non-familial element found in any of the crime scenes was microscopic, almost imperceptible. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of a very specific, rare type of pipe tobacco. It was an old, almost forgotten brand, a rich, earthy aroma. Forensic analysis had confirmed it at all the scenes, but it was so subtle that it could easily be missed by a casual observer. It wasn't a strong, lingering scent, but rather a faint echo, as if someone had smoked it earlier and the scent had clung to their clothes. This was the first real lead, however tenuous, they had. It wasn't something that could be used for a direct identification, but it was a characteristic. It suggested a particular habit, a specific type of person. Maxwell and Jenkins seized on it. "Who smokes this kind of tobacco?" Maxwell mused, turning a sample vial in his hand. "It's not exactly common these days." Jenkins nodded. It's an older blend, typically favored by those who appreciate tradition, perhaps even a bit of a classicist. It's a small detail, but in a case with so little, it's a significant one. The investigation shifted focus. Teams began to canvass tobacconists, specialty stores, and even antique shops in the vicinities of the murders, searching for anyone who regularly purchased this specific brand. It was a needle in a haystack, a desperate gamble, but it was something tangible. As winter deepened, and the White Rose Killer continued to elude capture, the nation found itself in a state of sustained anxiety. The fear was no longer confined to small towns. It permeated every corner of American society. The echo of Elmwood had become a roar, and the silent terror of the White Rose Killer had put a nation on edge, waiting, watching, and praying for the nightmare to end. The hunt for the ghost, for the man behind the White Rose, had become the most urgent and defining challenge of the decade. The cold grip of winter had finally begun to loosen its hold, giving way to the tentative promises of spring. Yet, for America, the chill of fear remained, a persistent phantom haunting homes and communities. The White Rose Killer, having left a trail of shattered families and an unshakable sense of dread, had seemingly vanished. 3 months had passed since the Martins were murdered in Cleveland, and the unsettling silence was almost worse than the violence itself. It was the calm before the storm, a period of agonizing anticipation. Detective James Maxwell, his face etched with exhaustion, his eyes mirroring the weariness of a nation, refused to be lulled into complacency. The temporary lull, he knew, was simply a strategic retreat by a calculating predator. Dr. Sarah Jenkins, equally relentless, spent countless hours refining her profile, delving deeper into the psychological nuances of an individual who could orchestrate such horror with such chilling precision. The only thread, however thin, they had to pull was the faint scent of the rare pipe tobacco. Investigations into its procurement had been slow and arduous. The specific blend, Willow Creek Reserve, was an artisanal tobacco produced in limited quantities by a small, family-owned business in rural Virginia. Their customer base was niche, loyal, and fiercely private. It was a tip-off from a clerk in a small, out-of-the-way tobacconist in Allentown, Pennsylvania, that finally broke the stalemate. The clerk, an elderly man named Arthur, who had been an avid pipe smoker himself for decades, remembered a specific customer. "He wasn't from around here," Arthur recalled, his voice raspy. "Mid-40s, well-dressed, always polite. Came in every few months, bought a significant amount of Willow Creek Reserve. Said he liked the consistency, the way it burned." Arthur paused, thoughtfully. "Always paid in cash. Never gave a name. Just had a distinct way about him. Very particular." "Particular how, Arthur?" Maxwell pressed, leaning forward. "Controlled, I suppose," Arthur mused. "Always precise, never a wasted movement. And he had these eyes. They were very still, like a pond on a windless day. Always looking, but never giving anything away." The description, though vague, resonated with Jenkins's profile. Highly controlled, meticulous, intelligent. The cash payments, the lack of a name, further supported the image of someone who prized anonymity and left no paper trail. This was their ghost. A painstaking cross-referencing of every known purchase of Willow Creek Reserve over the past year, combined with witness descriptions from other tobacconists, began to paint a fragmented picture. A pattern emerged. The individual seemed to travel. His purchases were made in a wide arc across the northeastern United States, always in towns near major interstate highways. The breakthrough came when a sharp-eyed analyst noticed a subtle anomaly. One particular purchase, made 3 days before the Morgan murders in Elmwood, was unusually large. The same pattern was observed before the Anderson and Miller murders. It was a seemingly innocuous detail, but for Maxwell and Jenkins, it was the tell. The killer wasn't just buying tobacco. He was stocking up before his grim pilgrimages. The description of the particular man, combined with the purchase patterns, led them to a handful of individuals who fit the general age and demeanor. With no fingerprints, no DNA, and no solid identification, the task was still daunting. Then a stroke of grim luck. A retired high school history teacher from Elmwood, Agnes Periwinkle, known for her sharp memory and even sharper wit, saw a composite sketch based on Arthur's description on a national news program. She immediately called the hotline. "That's Mr. Silas Croft," she declared, her voice firm. "He was my student many years ago, came back to town a few years back, bought the old Henderson place outside of Elmwood. Quiet man, kept to himself, always very neat, liked his pipes too. Smoked that fancy stuff." Maxwell's heart pounded. Silas Croft, the old Henderson place. It was barely 5 miles from the Morgan residence, and he had purchased Willow Creek Reserve shortly before the murders. The name, the location, the habit, it all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Silas Croft was an enigma. He had been an exceptional student, brilliant but withdrawn. After graduating from Elmwood High, he had disappeared for decades, only to return to his hometown, purchasing a secluded property on the outskirts. He lived a reclusive life, rarely interacting with anyone, his presence a quiet, almost forgotten fixture of the community. No one had ever truly known him, and that, Maxwell realized, was the most terrifying thing of all. A full background check on Silas Croft revealed a meticulous, almost sterile life. No criminal record, no significant relationships. A history of temporary, low-profile jobs that involved travel. He was a ghost in plain sight, a man who had mastered the art of being unremarkable. His quiet, almost invisible existence had been his perfect camouflage. The surveillance operation on Silas Croft's property was initiated immediately and with extreme caution. The secluded Henderson place, overgrown with ivy and surrounded by dense woods, offered the perfect cover. FBI agents, state troopers, and Maxwell himself maintained a discreet watch, their every move calculated to avoid detection by a man they now knew to be incredibly observant and cunning. Days turned into a tense, agonizing week. Croft continued his quiet routine, tending to his garden, going on solitary walks in the woods, occasionally driving into town for supplies. He smoked his pipe on his porch, the faint, rich scent of Willow Creek Reserve occasionally wafting through the autumn air. He was utterly unremarkable, chillingly normal. And that normalcy was the most disturbing thing of all. Maxwell and Jenkins, reviewing every piece of information, every detail of Croft's life, pieced together a devastating narrative. Silas Croft, the quiet, unassuming man, harboring a lifetime of resentment, likely stemming from a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy and isolation. The families he targeted were symbols of the warmth, connection, and normalcy he had been denied or felt incapable of achieving. The white rose, once a symbol of twisted purity, now seemed to represent his desire to cleanse, to erase, to exert ultimate control over the idyllic lives he resented. The tactical team was assembled, the warrant secured. The decision was made to move in during the early hours of the morning, when Croft would most likely be asleep. The plan was meticulously rehearsed, every contingency accounted for. They were dealing with a highly dangerous individual, potentially armed, and certainly cunning. At 3:17 a.m., under the cloak of a moonless night, the team breached the Henderson house. The entry was swift, silent, and flawlessly executed. The house was meticulously neat, almost eerily so, reflecting the killer's pervasive need for control. Every book was aligned, every surface gleaming. They found Silas Croft in his bed, asleep, a faint smile playing on his lips. On his nightstand, next to a well-worn copy of Edgar Allan Poe, sat a small, polished wooden box. Inside, carefully nestled on a bed of velvet, were several dried white roses. They were brittle, their petals brown and faded, but unmistakable. And next to them, a thin, exquisitely crafted hunting knife with a polished wooden handle and a razor-sharp blade. The murder weapon. The arrest was surprisingly uneventful. Croft offered no resistance, no struggle, no outburst. His eyes, those still, pond-like eyes, simply regarded them with a calm, almost serene expression. It was the look of a man who knew he had played his game, and now the game was over. He simply offered a quiet, "I suppose you've finally found me." The interrogation that followed was a chilling testament to Croft's profound psychopathy. He spoke with a dispassionate, almost academic detachment, recounting his horrific deeds with an unnerving lack of remorse. He confessed to all the murders, detailing the planning, the execution, and his twisted motivations. "They were perfect," he explained, his voice even devoid of emotion. "Too perfect. It was a disease, this perfection, this happiness. It needed to be purged. I was cleansing the world, one family at a time." He spoke of the white roses, not as an act of remorse, but as a signature, a symbol of his art. "Purity," he declared, "in its ultimate form. I brought silence to their perfect lives." He admitted to carefully observing his chosen families for weeks, sometimes months, before striking, learning their routines, their vulnerabilities. He would then bypass their security, usually by picking locks or exploiting an unlocked window, moving with the stealth of a phantom. The precise stab wound, he explained, was an act of control, a testament to his mastery over life and death. The crushing revelation of Silas Croft, the quiet man from Elmwood, as the White Rose Killer, sent a final, powerful tremor through the nation. The relief of his capture was palpable, a collective sigh of release, but it was accompanied by a profound sense of horror and disbelief. The monster hadn't been an external threat, an unknown entity from the dark corners of society. He had been one of them, a seemingly ordinary man living among them, his malevolence hidden behind a facade of quiet normalcy. The trial of Silas Croft was a national spectacle, dominating headlines for months. His chilling confessions, his cold demeanor, and the sheer brutality of his crimes riveted the country. He was eventually convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. As the years passed, the immediate fear of the White Rose Killer subsided, replaced by a lingering unease. The name Silas Croft became a grim chapter in American criminal history, a stark reminder of the hidden darkness that can reside within the human heart. The White Rose, once a symbol of beauty and innocence, became irrevocably linked with terror and the brutal destruction of life. Detective James Maxwell, though hailed as a hero, carried the weight of the White Rose Killer case for the rest of his career. He had stared into the abyss of human depravity and had seen the chilling face of a man who destroyed not for personal gain or passion, but for a twisted, incomprehensible sense of purpose. Dr. Sarah Jenkins continued her work, using the insights gained from Croft to better understand the dark corners of the criminal mind. Elmwood, and the other towns scarred by the White Rose Killer, eventually began to heal. The fear receded, replaced by a cautious rebuilding of trust and community. But the echoes of Elmwood, the genesis of fear, and the chilling legacy of the White Rose Killer would forever serve as a somber reminder of the fragility of peace, the insidious nature of evil, and the crushing revelation that sometimes the monster truly is the man next door. The story of Silas Croft became a cautionary tale, etched into the collective memory of a nation that had learned, in the most brutal way imaginable, that true horror can sometimes bloom from the most unassuming of places.